Welcome to the Ice Team Podcast. I'm Jason Durham, your host for this episode, and I'm really excited for this one because I love when I have an opportunity to talk to people who are highly educated about fish and our fisheries biology, and I love asking questions. And today I've got a special guest, Scott Mackenthun. Did I say that right? Mackenthun?
Mackenthun. There you go. You're good.
I heard somebody say Mackenthun once, and I go, it's almost like moccasin. And now I've totally tricked myself out of it because I heard one person incorrectly pronounce your name, Scott. I am so glad you're on the show. And Scott, you're fisheries supervisor. You've had a lot of experience with fisheries. Tell us a little bit about your background, where you're located, and just kind of how you got into this role in fisheries.
Yeah, you bet. So I'll go back to the beginning, I guess. I was kind of a fishing fool, which isn't an easy thing to do if you grow up on a farm. And particularly if you grow up on a farm that has animals, which is what our farm did. We had hogs and dairy cattle, and we were about 2.5 miles away from Lake Marion in McLeod County.
Okay, how many head? I am not. I don't know if you know this or not, Scott, but I really do not have a farm background. It might surprise you, but I know how to ask. How many head of cattle did you have?
That's right. We were rotating through, milking about 40 at a time, and of course you've got some that aren't that are not milking, they're dry, that are out of lactation cycle. And so we rotated through. And then on the other side of the coin, we had farrow to finish hog operation where we had 40 stalls. We had a breeding kind of center. Farrow to finish means farrow is, for swine farmers, farrow is birthing, and finish is finishing that hog to marketable size, usually around 250 pounds or so. And so, it's one of those things like, if I stop doing my job right now, what are the things I could do? I could not be a kindergarten teacher. They'd never take me.
I could not be a
fishing guide. I could not be a fishing guide because they're way too smart. I could maybe be an okay pig farmer and maybe milk some cows on the side. But God bless all my friends that still do that. It's a lot of work. It's no days off, no vacations. The few times that we did go out and go fishing, you'd come back and the pigs would be out running around, or 20% of the herd had mastitis, or, something would go wrong. So it just reinforced the idea of we're never going anywhere. And so there were so many years that we have a family property on my mother's side that I was so excited to go up and go fishing. And there were so many years you were waiting until the last 2 hours before you're scheduled to leave to see if Dad's going to say it's okay to go or not. So I was a fishing fool. Long story short, I was actually, because of that ag background, I was in 4-H, I was in FFA, and I did an interview at the Hutchinson DNR Fisheries office with Chris Kavanaugh, who is now retired. Chris spent most of his career up in Grand Rapids in an area and a regional position. And he basically had a cup of coffee in Hutchinson. I think he was there for 1.5 years, but it just so happened to be the time that I came in and interviewed him. I'm like, man, this is the coolest job ever. I want to do that someday. So here was this little second grader who set his life goal to become a fisheries biologist. And I followed that path diligently, attending the University of Minnesota, stayed on for grad school, and then jumped into employment with the agency, with the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources. And that's where the background came in fisheries, and have been full-time with the state of Minnesota since 2008.
2008. Okay, so I'm just doing a little math in my head. Okay, I got it.
So, did you show your work?
No, I didn't, and I'm not going to tell you the answer either. But anyway, what all have you gotten to experience in this time? Like, give us a couple of like pinnacles of your career so far, and an interesting project that you just go, man, I'm really proud of that.
Man, pride, pinnacles, man. It's fun. You get to do a lot of great stuff. I think the funny thing, I'll probably repeat this line to the point of turning it into a cliche, perhaps, but everybody's excited to go handle a bunch of fish, and that is the truth, right? There's lots of pictures when I was younger and had more hair with fish that you're wrestling around with, and all the cool stuff that you get to do on lakes and rearing ponds and helping out at egg take stations and traveling around the state. And that's all fun and fine and dandy and a lot of fun. But what you end up doing is making the switch at some point where you care about the people. You sort of become invested in the resource. And I mean that all the way around, right? When we think about fisheries, back to core terminology like fisheries, the breakdown is it's a three-pronged sort of approach. It's habitat, it's fish, and it's people. And there's a lot of times I'm bringing that back into our agency, that we make sure that there's a focus amongst all three, that we're not too heavily weighted one way or the other. The people element of it matters. Why I bring up that people side is I think that's where that switch happens at some point in the career. We're like, man, you really start to enjoy the people side of it, what we accomplish as a team, working together at those local stations, the projects that you take on, the people in the communities that you work with. They're invested. If people are passionate about one thing, it's natural resources and it's fish, especially in the state of Minnesota. I know that, Ron Shera, who's longtime president of the grassroots organization Min Fish, talks about wanting Minnesota to be the state of fish, right? And fishing, not the state of hockey, but the state of fish or the state of fishing. And I think he's onto something with that. Like, start traveling around the state and you see all the different towns that have fish celebrations and all the places that are associated or iconic with fish and fish imagery. Your favorite school district is located where the largest tiger muskie statue is, right?
I didn't know if you were going to bring that up or not. I was going to make sure that I interjected it. And if Drew is listening, yeah, I don't know if you're aware of this, but Nevis is home to the world's largest tiger muskie. Well, I mean,
right
that's
on.
what it says, but it is the world's largest concrete tiger muskie statue. Nobody has caught the world's largest tiger muskie actually there, but boy, it makes you dream about it when you see that statue.
So right on. I mean, it's a part of the culture, and that's what's so cool about Minnesota, about the Upper Midwest, and that's where the tie in there is just the people, right? When I've worked at a couple different stations, and I've traveled around a little bit, even as an intern for short stints, and worked in different places, and been blessed to meet a lot of different people across the state, fish a lot of different places, and see it from the angler's perspective, and then be able to dabble in resource issues from the professional side of it. And we've got a really great resource with great people that are part of that. And so that's a long way of saying, yeah, the people element matters. And yeah, I don't get out in the field and get my hands dirty as much. I've got a crew that does a lot of that, but you still get to get out a little bit since we've become so downsized, and because you have to work as a team and help each other out. And the people, those connections really are satisfying. So if you're talking about that, it's really working with the people. It's when we've had open houses, when we've had public meetings, when we do outreach opportunities. Hutchinson, where I work, it's the avid anglers group that we have. It's other means. It's talking to you right now. Those are fun. The field days are fun. There's always things that get us excited, whether it's new information that we're learning about anglers from a creel survey, for instance, a couple of years ago on the Minnesota River, and learning what people are targeting now, or what their satisfaction levels are with angling in the state, or what their thoughts and opinions are on using technology, or that element is fascinating. Our really big one that's been in place for 10 years is this really exciting, and we keep hitting all these landmarks. I can remember 10 years ago wanting to, being really excited, falling out of my chair, excited about discovering this lower Mississippi strain of walleye, which there'll be a story coming out in the May-June issue of our Minnesota Conservation Volunteer magazine this year, 2025, talking about how all of that has played out and the importance of this southern Minnesota lower Mississippi strain walleye, and just seeing us hit those benchmarks, and what does that mean, with some of the science that goes behind it, and what does that mean for policy and moving forward and what we're going to do and how we're going to be efficient with it, and lots of stuff I could spin off and on and on and on about it, but those are just a few quick highlights.
Yeah, and those are big deals. I mean, I think about some of the things that have occurred in my lifetime that I've gotten to witness. And, you brought up an important point too a while ago. And I just love listening to you speak because you're such an intelligent person. And man, hearing about fisheries it gets me excited because I'm a fish nerd, right? That's why anybody's listening to this podcast, but you're a nerd. If you're listening to this, you are a fish nerd officially. And I remember that point in time where I helped the DNR with a study the first time I ever did. And actually that was to help out Jason Mitchell. It was to help him out for his show. It was to film the DNR stripping eggs at Woman Lake over by Hackensack. And I went over there and my gosh, I still reference the information that I got from that one time. I still reference it in seminars and articles. I learned so much information just in that one time being next to all of these people who are, ingrained in this. And here's the thing about people that work in fisheries. They do it because they love it. And when you start talking to somebody like yourself, you just hear that passion come out. And I appreciate that so much. And of course, I appreciate what you say about the people portion of it too. And I think, and I'd like you to elaborate on this a little bit about the public and how their input, and you were talking about people from a relationship standpoint, but I want to shift that to people, the public, and how their input influences what the DNR does for management and how it affects that.
Right on. Yeah, I'll definitely try to touch on that. I just was thinking of this when you were talking about being a fish nerd, and it's what's really refreshing for anyone that's listening to this podcast and that tunes in regularly is that you recognize your own tribe, right? Like you recognize that you are a fish nerd, you're in love with it, you listen to it, you consume anything fish and fishing related. And I think for a long time, like if you were a nerd about something or you were really into the science, like that wasn't the cool thing to do, right? And it wasn't until I got off to school, to the university, and had one of my first internships where I worked with the late Roland Sigurdsson. And Roland oversaw Minnesota DNR's Minocqua program. I was an intern in that program where we taught fishing clinics. He was the first guy that I heard talk about being a fish geek or a fish nerd, and he made it sound so cool. And, it was like later the next year, my sophomore year in college, and I was finally taking ichthyology, and you're starting to take your core courses. And you could kind of, stick your chin up that, hey, you were nerdy about this and you were into it. And it's not till you get a little bit older in life, a little wiser, that you go, not everybody needs to be into the same things. And, it's cool to geek out over stuff and to be so excited about it that you build that passion. And it's nice to be amongst your own tribe. And many times, those are those people that love fish and fishing, but I digress. I got to answer your question. Your question was how does the department interact with the public? Is that right? Or can you ask that again, Jason?
Yeah, just kind of more or less. How is like regulation or law influenced by public opinion? Because right. I mean, some people think that it's just the DNR making decisions, but that's not the case.
Yeah, you are correct. That isn't just the case. I would go back to what we were talking about earlier, where we were saying that, that fisheries is that three-part stool, right? Where it's habitat and it's fish and it's people. And it really is similar when it comes to making decisions. There's a ecological side of what you want to do. You want to make sure that whatever you're opting to do is going to be beneficial and it's suited for the biology of the lake. But then there's a huge component of it, which is the social side, which is what do anglers want? What's acceptable to them? Like one of the things that's really brewing right now in Minnesota and elsewhere, I can list two examples. I guess one that's specific to Minnesota and one that's elsewhere across the ice belt is technology and forward-facing sonar, right? There's public's kind of all over the map. Is it good? Is it bad? Do they have experience with it? Do they not? Does it have a biologically meaningful impact? Is it a fair chase question, which is something that our agency just takes our hands off of? We don't get into the realm of fair chase. We try to look strictly at biology because the fair chase aspect is more politics. And then the Minnesota case example is the walleye bag limit. We've had a 6-fish walleye bag limit, which interestingly is actually higher than some of our surrounding states. And there's a lot of conversation about shrinking that down to 4. And on the science side, we don't have compelling evidence that would say, boy, we really need to shrink this down because people are so good at catching fish. In fact, it's just the opposite. Our creels, and man, if you ever get a chance to run a creel, you really do learn a lot from it. But it'll tell you, the old adage is true, 10% of people catching 90% of the fish. Like we have a lot of folks that show up in that creel and don't catch a lot of fish. So if we knock the limit back from 6 to 4, we're really not making a meaningful impact to reducing harvest and, recycling more fish or keeping more fish in a lake.
So what would be why would you advocate for it? Why would someone advocate for it then if it doesn't have any biological impact?
I would say it's this. I think our chief and our section, our fisheries section manager and our section of fisheries within the agency are largely taking a neutral to supporting position. And it's been because we've sort of been asked to, look into this, and, where it's really moved along has been on the social side, where we ask people if they're supportive of it or not. We have more people that would like it to do that, just so it kind of mirrors what a lot of the bag limits are on our large walleye lakes. And because it's back to, again, a topic that we typically don't touch, but that fair, what is acceptable to people? And they kind of go, well, geez, I can get a good meal for myself and a spouse, maybe even some kids off 4 fish. Or if I need more, then I'll have a friend go out with me, or I'll have my spouse fish with me, or I'll have my kids fish with me, and we can still have enough. I mean, it's kind of, I think the mindset is changing over time about how many fish do you really want or need? Do you really want to fill a freezer full of fish? They're definitely not as good as when they're fresh versus when they're frozen. So I think there's some elements of that, but it's largely just what people are interested in, what we're being asked to do. I know I've heard quotes, or a few of our employees have said, well, what happens if harvest does go up and, technological advances mean that there is more harvest? Then maybe this is a compensatory action where it's more sustainable because people aren't able to take as many fish when the getting is good. I could maybe, I could live with that. I'm really indifferent on it. At a personal level, like it doesn't really matter to me, 6 or 4. I enjoy a meal of walleyes from time to time, and it's really not going to change. But for some folks, it's like everything, it becomes polarized and people have strong opinions one way or the other.
It's really an interesting topic to me for a couple different reasons. I mean, as a fishing guide, people have a different mindset sometimes when they're not in their local territory and when they're on vacation. Because
True.
Most people would agree, number one, you spend money differently when you're on vacation. Like those incidental things aren't as big of a deal as they would be at home. You'd kind of have second thoughts about it. Like, maybe I shouldn't buy that, umbrella at the gas station when it's pouring rain for $80 or whatever. But the other thing is they tend to have different ideas about how much fish they want to keep. And so I get an opportunity there to be a really good coach and coach people on, hey, you might want to consider this, or, You don't really like guiding for eel pout. You don't want to keep these and freeze them. They're awful if you cook them
Yeah,
after they're frozen. So
true.
we don't want to go out and take a whole bunch of these fish, right? Well, the angler satisfaction part of dropping the limit is a really interesting psychological part of it. So and some people may have heard this story before. I might have even told it on the podcast, but back in 2016, I went up to Sitka, Alaska, and I went with my parents, and it was just fantastic. I took them up there for a once in a lifetime experience. And we went in June. And at that time, up in Sitka, the limit was for king salmon 6 fish per person per day. Think about how much that limit has changed just in those few years, in 8-9 years. That the week after we were there, though, the limit would change just because of the timing of the season, and it would then drop to 4 king salmon per person per day. And the owner of the lodge told me, he goes, it's so interesting because people will come the same week that you're here when you can keep 6, and they'll only catch 5, and they'll be livid. They will be so upset that they didn't get their limit. And the following week, you'll have guests there when the limit drops to 4, and they'll catch 4, and they will be absolutely elated. Even though they have been able to take and consume 1 fewer fish than the week before, the attitude is polar opposites.
And you just totally hit on something about how arbitrary that can be, but how true it is. You can just zero to hero with, how fulfilling it is for some to get to that point. And that's part of that. There's some really great human dimensions research done on satisfaction for hunters and anglers. And they actually go through these predictable stages, right? They just want to get out and, use the equipment and go out and fish a little bit or hunt. I'll just stick to fishing since we're talking fishing. And then they'll kind of move off to, they want to get a limit. And then after that, they want to get a trophy. And then they move to a method stage where they want to do it a particular way, like fly fishing, or maybe they want to, catch their fish sight fishing through the ice or whatever, special method it is that they're going to do. And then finally they get to that total sportsman where they kind of just enjoy the experience of getting out. And it is this evolutionary process. And there are folks with different species that are stuck in a different stage than with another species. And you're 100% right. It's interesting how people can view that, what is defined by a state fish and game agency as a limit. That's, for some folks, that's what the goal is. And anything less than that is a failure. And it's interesting too, going back to the walleye bag conversation, is I'm wondering, not that you speak for all guides, but is that a thing where, boy, if we just lower the bar, maybe our job's a little easier?
I love it. And no one, rightfully so, to, say something like that in my area. Oh, gosh, for sure it would make my job easier in a sense, but we're still not going to get to the limit most days. I mean, if you look even if you look at like walleye angling, okay, if you look statewide, how many hours an angler has to put in to catch a walleye? Do you know the number off the top of your head, Scott?
Yeah, it's like 5.5, and we should come back to that topic, but go on.
Okay, yes. So let's say it's 5.5 hours for an angler to catch a walleye. Okay, if I'm running a 4-hour trip, okay, do you see where the odds lie there? Now, granted, that's taking everybody's angling, and very, very novice anglers that, just aren't going to catch those fish, or they haven't lucked into them. And so you have to take those hours into consideration, obviously. So going out with a guide, yes, you should have a higher catch rate. For sure. But still, just like in our area with the population of walleyes the way it is, there's a lot of days you don't get limits. But there's a lot of days that you catch walleyes. And of course, you have a crack at catching the biggest walleye of your life on just about any of our lakes here. So we have got that going for us. But you're not going to bring home, your take of 14-inch walleyes. Probably not.
Right. No, that's it's good. It's good. But yeah, I think you're putting a bow on it. That's a little insight. I mean, it's not all biology and it's not all social. It's kind of a marriage of the two when it comes to how things are run. It's also important to remember that your state fish and game agencies, they can't arbitrarily just go in and change laws, rules, regulations. Those are set by your legislature. So when people complain about, well, we have a closed season for this and we can't use this device and we can't do this and we can't have a second line in the summer and so on and so forth, that's where you really need your legislators to get involved. The DNR's rulemaking powers in Minnesota, for example, are highly limited. It takes a long process to get rules changed. That includes a public comment period. It includes a review by an administrative law judge, and it requires a lot of background and explanation of why you want to make those changes. So it's important. I think there's a lot of misconceptions with DNR about who does what, or why is this regulation synopsis say I have to do this, this, and this? Is it the DNR telling me to do that? No, it's just them breaking down what's in rule and statute for that particular state.
So really, you'd say that it's more interpretive than anything.
I wouldn't say interpret. I mean, sometimes there's elements of how a law is written that's open for interpretation, but that's one where I would send you to the conservation officers and the Division of Enforcement. They're best suited for answering those types of questions. Not passing the buck, just being totally honest with you. They're the ones that are going to write the ticket. So if you want to get into how a law is written or interpreted, those are the people to talk to, not me. Talk to the person that would write you the ticket, not the person that's not writing the ticket.
I appreciate that insight so much because I think there's a lot of listeners that don't fully grasp and understand that. And you talking about like lawmaking and rulemaking, have you experienced in your career people that find out that you work for the DNR and they come unglued, that they just really give it to you?
Oh yeah. And I like to laugh or joke about it. Like, we're going out to eat and, like, or let's say we get off the lake and we're, got to grab lunch on the way back to working up the fish back at the office, or, cleaning up the gear with the intern. And the joke was always, oh, don't wear your DNR hat. They might spit in your burger. So it's like a cross section of society, right? There's some wonderful people that are really passionate, that will listen to the work that you do. They're engaged, they're informed, they're not ignorant on topics. They've educated themselves. They know all the different sides of an issue. They understand where they've taken the time to educate themselves, or they talk to you one-on-one and they understand where you're coming from. They understand you're a normal person. You have a rationale and a reason behind it, because there's a great, normally I tell people, you don't have to agree with everything that I'm doing from a management perspective, but I want you to hear me out. I want you to hear why I came to this decision, what the background and support for it is, or the rationale behind it. You have some of those folks that are supportive and pat you on the back. There's a wide band of people that I think are neutral, or maybe they're sort of just checked out and go with the flow. And then there's some folks that really, maybe they have an axe to grind from, they were ticketed for something, or they really dislike how, a lake or a federally endangered protected mammal is managed in the state, for instance. And they just have an axe to grind with you, and they sort of take it out on you. You learn to roll with it. There's a wide section of society, just as is true probably in education and in guiding and everywhere else, right?
I would think so. I mean, really any type of where you're dealing with people, that you can't make everybody happy all of the time. But from my experience, living in a small community and everybody knows everybody, the people at the fisheries, so they're your neighbors and everything. And so I always had just such a positive outlook on fisheries management. And I love going to the meetings when they ask for public input, that I love going to those meetings and hearing the information that they have to present. Like they're just giving this to you. You don't have to look it up. They're just throwing it out for you. And as a fishing guide, my gosh, I love to hear that information.
Well, and you actually get to ask the question, right there to the person that's the subject matter expert. I mean, that's the nice thing about it. But sadly, we just don't have all that good of attendance anymore with those sorts of things. And one quote that you bring to mind, you hit the nail on the head about you just can't make everyone happy. And one of the quotes I keep in my back pocket that I really like is from Bill Gates, where he said, if you want to make everyone happy, open an ice cream shop, because then people can get whatever flavor they want, right?
Yeah.
When it comes to the decisions we make with natural resources, sometimes it's a zero-sum game, right? There's going to be people that love your decision and people that hate it. And you try to bridge the divide. You try to get to a point that people can understand, hey, if they disagree with your decision, at least they understand why you made it. But I've had to break unpleasant news to some folks a few times, and luckily calmer heads have prevailed and people have been rational. It's just, you hear horror stories from 30, 40 years ago of gymnasiums full of people, yelling and screaming bloody murder over natural resources decisions. So I hope that we as a society, and then also the people that we bring on board, are better trained in how to handle conflict, how to resolve conflict, how to work with people. Because working with fish is easy; they don't talk back to you. But the people, that's where you need some schooling and help.
So you've talked about this three-pronged approach to fisheries management: habitat, fish, and people. And the one thing we haven't talked a lot about is habitat. So how does that fit in? I feel like we don't hear about that as much from a fisheries management standpoint in terms of the habitat.
You are 100% correct. It's probably the little engine that doesn't get mentioned anywhere near enough. I've heard a lot of fisheries managers that have retired, and their retiring remarks are, something to the effect of stocking is not a panacea. In other words, it's not a cure-all. We've got to start to wean the public off of what they believe, and this idea that you can stock yourself to prosperity as we've gotten smaller and smaller, and budgets and per capita license sales, as that slips or you backslip a little bit, you have to figure out what's sustainable. And you've seen the workforce get smaller, and you have to prioritize where you put your work in. We do really great work with people, with the science, with the fish. The habitat thing is really a tougher topic, because you're talking about land ownership. You're talking about where can you have an impact. And there are places that we can have an impact. But if we look at our agency's fish habitat plan, and you look at Minnesota in general, we're talking about 3 biomes that are colliding here, right? We've got the prairie, we've got the hardwood, deciduous sort of forest, and then we've got the coniferous forest. And when we even break that down, now that sounds, very terrestrial, but when we break that down into aquatics, those are big changes from southwest to northeast in the state. And that habitat component really changes. There's a lot of private ownership in the southern part of the state, in the prairie region, and there's a lot of heavy impacts from land use. And then that scale bar slides the other way back to a lot of public land in the north and northeastern parts of the state, and not as much land impacts. And we think about, how do we prioritize our fish habitat dollars? Well, I'm paraphrasing about a 80-page document for you right now on our fish habitat plan, but in paraphrasing it succinctly, putting it in a nutshell, we want to stretch your dollars as far as we can, whether those are angling license dollars, federal excise taxes, or one-time appropriations from grant dollars like Lessard Sam's Outdoor Heritage Council, or lottery funds, or any other number of places that funds are available. We want to stretch those dollars as much as we can. So we like an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. In other words, we try to secure and protect riparian lands and waters that you can either purchase or put easements on to protect, to keep those habitats intact. And it's basically, you see that, right? The more impacted a watershed is around a lake, the many times that has impacts to the lake or water body itself, and then even the development on said lake. If we've got lots and lots of people moving out there and they're cutting down all the trees and pulling out all the cattails and mowing their turf grass to the edge of the water and treating everything like it's a golf course, it's not a good recipe for the fish. So it's a multi-pronged approach. You're trying to acquire land strategically with a shoestring budget. You're trying to connect habitats where you can. Like a perfectly good example is I'm talking to you right now from Duluth and this part of the state. There's been a lot of work done on reconnecting brook trout streams along the north shore of Lake Superior, where maybe culverts or bridges have failed. We've got streams that became disconnected, and those trout aren't able to have access the habitat that they need. So how can we work with counties and townships and highway departments to make sure that when we're doing road improvement projects that we can get those fish connected? Maybe it's looking at, there's a big chunk of land that's going to be for sale on, I don't know, Leech Lake. Let's buy a piece there that's going to protect some undeveloped shoreline that could be critically important for muskies or walleyes or bass or whatever to be spawning on vegetation substrates or on down trees or whatever it might be. It's, there's so many different facets to what you do with that habitat, but there's a wide variety of conditions when it comes to habitat in the state, as I described. There's places that are really heavily impacted and degraded, and there's places that are still in pretty good shape. And that's a lot to cover for one agency, but we're trying to do the best that we can, and we're trying to protect what we can. We're trying to make those dollars stretch as far as we can.
For sure. And I appreciate hearing that too. As a taxpayer, you want to know that your money's, not buying gold toilet seats, right? Because that's what we
Right.
kind of hear of in when you hear like government and knowing that the DNR, I mean, you guys aren't driving around brand new vehicles. I know this. So,
well, let me tell you that I'll back you up on this. This is one thing on the fleet program, just to make a correction here. Fleet being, the vehicles that you drive around. We get to drive pretty nice vehicles around. The reason being is you only drive them for a handful of years. You send them to auction, and then you get the highest return on investment. So they've done the calculations on where is it best for us so we're not spending a bunch of money on repair. Fleet Services sort of runs it that way. But I'll tell you, I will say this. So we get to drive newer, nicer vehicles, but look on the inside. They're stripped down to nothing. There's no features in there. It made me chuckle a little bit. You're like, well, you're not driving a new vehicle. Well, they are driving new vehicles. They're just turning them around on a regular rotation.
And
they're minor detail.
They're not over the top with options and things like that. Same with your boats. I mean, you're not pulling up with forward-facing sonar and side imaging and you do, but how about this? A DNR boat looks very different than a fishing boat.
It does. Those are some heavy duty. If you're looking at a commercial fisherman's boat or a DNR boat, they're designed to go to hell and back, and in many cases, they've been there.
I've been on some of those trips for sure, and you had brought up before about going to these public meetings and asking questions when you have people there that have the answers and the knowledge. That's what I always enjoyed about volunteering with the DNRs, just being able to ask any question that I could at any time. Hey, you brought up something. You were talking about, and you've brought this up a couple different times about the DNR being a smaller agency now, or being strapped for resources. Tell us a little bit about that. How is it different now than it was, when you first started or before that?
Well, I think the big thing I've seen in my 17 years is, one, the big change that came about was the legacy amendment. So Lessard Sam's Outdoor Heritage Council being formed, and that 3/8 of a penny tax. A lot of folks thought that it was like Missouri, where that went directly to the DNR. That is not the case. It's just like the lottery funds. These are earmarked for natural resources, but they have to be you have to earn those dollars in different ways. The mechanisms are a little bit different. LCCMR has that's the lottery funds. LCCMR has a committee that reviews all these proposals and allocates the funds accordingly. And similarly, there's a council that approves appropriations for Lessard SAMs. So this isn't going directly to DNR. DNR can propose projects and get funds that way, but that's a very small part of the overall budget. I guess I've seen we've gone from places that had 5 or 6 workers and we had specialty crews, and those are largely gone. We're down to the base 4 at stations. And I see it with, at our station, if someone had maternity leave or paternity leave, or if someone is sick or someone takes a vacation, or we look at how many crews can we send out. Like, you can't send a single person out to go lift a large trap net, right? Modified fyke net. This is a 2-person operation. You got one person driving the boat, the other person grabbing the frame and pulling the thing over, or doing it together, depending on how heavy the fish catch is. So when we run crews in the field, it's at least a 2-person operation. Sometimes it can be 3 if we're expecting, heavy winds and waves, or, high fish catches. So, what you think about, that means you are sending a crew of 2 or 3 to one lake. You can only go to so many places and collect so much information in a given field sampling season. And so I just have seen the impacts of a consolidated workforce and a smaller workforce. And I don't want anyone to ever think that I'm belly aching about this. We're proud to be trying to stretch your license dollars. Like I said, these are folks that are passionate about what they do. And I hope that the public will continue to support that this agency goes out and hires the best people for the job, and he tries to have the most talented workforce out there that is passionate about. Because if we just hire whomever and they don't have the passion, we're not going to be able to go all that far, right? But those are the people that we have. They're passionate. They want to get out. They want to make a difference. And they're willing to stretch it out. That both of the field stations I've worked at as a full-time employee, that's been the thing. You're tapping into people's pride. They want to do a good job, collect good information, and it's hard. No one up above us is saying, well, you should take this off your plate. Instead, it's no one's ever telling you to take things away. They're always telling you to put more on. And you have to kind of make those decisions about what your limits are, and you have to prioritize your work, at an area level. And everyone goes through that. And we have a defensible strategy that we lay out where our most important resources are in the work area that I'm in, and how are you going to do that over the course of the year, and how are you going to break it all down. But I bring that up to say that people have to have reasonable expectations about what these offices can do, because you can only do so much. And if you want to make decisions on resource management, you need good data to inform those decisions. So it's, there's some places that aren't going to be super high priority that are going to skate along. Lakes that have been smooth sailing for a long period of time, they're probably not going to get looked at as closely. And then there's other places that are either higher profile or more important, or more users, or there's more management actions going on that are going to justify more resources put into them. So I don't know. It's I feel like it's worth mentioning that we're smaller, but we're making it work that way. I don't see us getting bigger, just because, again, that whole idea of license sales are flat to slightly falling. But I think they're going to stabilize and stay at a certain point in Minnesota because we have this strong fishing culture.
I totally agree. Just the heritage behind it, I can see that continuing on. What, even though the agency's smaller in this moment, what are you doing exceptionally well? Give me one thing that the DNR right now, it stands out. You do a lot of things really well, but give me one thing you just go, man, we are crushing it in this area.
Our data set is the envy of other states and provinces, and that's remarkable considering you've got 11,482 lakes over 10 acres in size, right? You got a lot of resources. So other states look at, everyone that's listening, most everyone, that if you're a Minnesotan and you're listening to this podcast, you're familiar with Lake Finder. It is the most popular portion of the DNR's website. It's a database that gets used by private companies for putting together, their data sets and trying to do analytics on what we have. And that's fine. It's, it's in the public domain. They can go out and get it. It's out there for anyone. That's the beauty of it, though. Like, we have this really good data that we've collected with standardized sampling for how many years? Now, there's
Right.
50, 60 years. Now, there's caveats to it, but that's a pretty amazing data set that you can detect changes, see changes, look at relative abundance, see growth, see your class strength in some instances where we're looking a little more closely. There's a lot of really good data, and it's out there for the public to use. Like, if that's the thing, like, I always, for people that want to be critical of what's done in Minnesota, I am always hopeful that it's an angler that's well traveled, because then I'll take it with a grain of salt. But if you haven't gone elsewhere, you don't see that. Like, I've traveled and fished in a lot of other states. You can't find information on those fisheries. You can't find out public access information, maps, bathymetry, stocking data records, like this. All that stuff is right at your fingertips on the website. So I would say, if I had to point to one thing, it's that. It's an incredible data set that we're still building, and it's the bedrock of decision making and a lot of the work that we do at a fish biology, fish science level.
I appreciate you bringing that up too, because I think a lot of people forget, just because it's you can access it so easily on your phone. Most people are doing it on their phones or computers, but I think they forget the connection with the DNR, that the DNR is actually doing this for them. This is a service, a public service. This is not a paid app. The one thing about it, though, like we were talking about being fish nerds, this is a really good way to lose a lot of time.
Yes.
And you don't look at it when you're going to the bathroom, because your legs will fall asleep. So I always make sure that you're in a safe place to do this. And if you've never heard of Lake Finder, DNR Lake Finder, if you've never heard of that before, look it up. If you're from out of state and you come to Minnesota, you're listening to this podcast and go, hey, I travel up to wherever, it doesn't matter. There's tons of information just available for you.
Yeah, it really is remarkable. And, boy, if I had that every time I traveled out of state to go somewhere else to be able to pour through things, it would be a heck of an advantage. But, and that's not to say that the other states aren't doing the work. They definitely are, especially considering most states don't have as many lakes and resources as we do here.
Right.
It's just maybe it's not accessible to the public as easily. They don't put it out, that sort of thing. So that's one thing that immediately comes to mind when you ask, hey, what are you doing really well?
Well, we talked about what you're doing really well. I don't want to talk about what you're not doing well, because there's no reason to. But I kind of want to shift that to, having all of this knowledge of our resources in the state. Is there something or anything that Minnesotans should be scared of or aware of or highly concerned about at this point?
Well, I mean, I would take the question on. I think it's only fair, for you as an interviewer to ask that question. I would say, so I'm going to answer your question, and I'm going to answer a question you're not asking, which is, well, what is your weakness, right? What's the weak point, or where's the opportunity that's being missed? And I would say, we already talked a little bit about habitat. Our habitat team is relatively small, and it's just a matter of how do you move the dollars around and where do you prioritize the work that's going to be done. You could argue you could put more into habitat, but like I was saying earlier, a lot of that is dependent on land that's held privately that you have no control over. So if it's outside of your circle of control, you really can't do a lot with it. And even doing work in lake, I mean, we get into those philosophical battles about, is it meaningful to do work in lake that, the science is hard to prove that it has an impact on fish populations if you try to manipulate structures or do things within a lake. It's challenging to assert some of those things, I guess, from the habitat perspective. So that's where I would point out, maybe that's a bit of a weakness, even though we have some incredible habitat in places like I was alluding to. And then your question,
I'm going to stop you for a second, though. Is there, so is there anything the public can do for people who are super passionate about the outdoors? Is there anything that they can do to help with that, to increase habitat management, or what can be done with habitat management?
Absolutely. Here's what I'm going to tell you as someone that used to do aquatic plant management permitting. In other words, so in layman's terms, in Minnesota, if you owned a property that was on a lake, you were allowed to put in for a permit to be able to treat aquatic vegetation if it was at a nuisance level, right? So you could, and that's in the eye of the beholder, right? That's a subjective term, what's at a nuisance level. But if you wanted to treat aquatic plants that were around your dock so that you could get your boat on and off your dock easier, you wanted your kids or your grandkids to swim around your dock, that was an opportunity. You know, you could put in for this treatment. Someone would come out, inspect the property. I used to do this job. And if it all, checked out, yep, looks like there's plants there that could be considered a nuisance, you'd be authorized for treatment. And even just like not that many people have those plant permits. It's just what I see in the part of the state that I work in where our lakes are heavily developed is, what is that cumulative impact, right?
Right.
When I see a lake in my part of the state in southern Minnesota, I see riprap, right? So great big boulders have been pulled in. I see turf grass, Kentucky bluegrass planted down to the edge of where the riprap is, giant docks, fire pits. I want people to enjoy the lakes, don't get me wrong, but what has happened, understatedly, and it's been talked about in the outdoor media and in the popular media for 40 years, is Minnesotans are loving our lakes to death. In other words, we love lakes so much that we move out to lakes and we want the view of the whole lake. So we cut the trees down and we want to put up a great, big, beautiful house and we want to have our dock with our boat on it. But what we've done in clearing everything out, taking out aquatic plants or using it so much, is that there's so much disturbance to that site that we don't have the aquatic plants there. We don't have the fish there, and the habitat has been destroyed, right? And it's a collective thing. It's not a thing. It's like death by 1,000 cuts. It's not like we can point to, well, it's just Joe Smith and Bob Anderson over here. It's just those two people. No, it's all of us collectively doing this on all these lots that cover 98% of this lake, right? I mean, it's a collective effort.
I totally agree. And, I have a lot of concern for our area. I'm in the Park Rapids area. We have a huge concentration of lakes and a lot of people that have lake homes there. And we do see this where, there was a progression of wanting the riprap, wanting the grass down to the water's edge. And I have concern about that for our area, but at the same time, as a society, like, that's the cool house to have. And I won't deny that I have that desire. Who wouldn't want a lake home with a swimming beach? And most people can't afford that super awesome sand that you're going to buy on a lake lot that, costs a lot of money. And so you're going to try to create that out of a lesser lake lot, and you're, converting that soft bottom to sand and hauling in the sand. I see people do it all the time, and it is concerning for sure. Are there any programs through the DNR? If somebody owns a lake property and they want to try to convert this and do what they can back to a natural filtering shoreline, are there any programs through the DNR or through private agencies that you know of that they can access either for guidance or support?
Yes. And you're going exactly where I was going with this, which is that one of the things I see with lake groups is, if I go talk to a group of property owners, I end up having a lot of people that are completely disinterested in what I'm talking about when it comes to fish. Their concerns are, weeds are taking over my lake. There's not a place for my grandkids to swim. And maybe it's an overgeneralization, but it seems to me we have a lot of people that they'd like to turn the lake into a swimming pool, and it's not. The lake was there first. It was habitat for fish and wildlife, and now we've sort of changed it. And so when you ask me what people could do to have a meaningful impact, I would say this. When I was working in that habitat position, I would occasionally get a unicorn that would come through. What I mean by that is if I issued a couple thousand, destruction of aquatic plant permits, I would issue anywhere from one to, I think 1 year I did as many as 4. Now keep that scale in mind. A couple thousand or a couple hundred versus, 1, 2, 3, 4. But those 1, 2, 3, 4 restoration permits that we issued were no fee permits. We didn't charge for it. We were authorizing people to be able to plant native species back in, and people did restoration work. And if I win a Mega Millions or I win the Powerball, which unfortunately I don't play the lottery enough.
Same, you and I both, but you dream about it. That's the excitement with it, is dreaming.
I'm too good at math to play it on the regular, but if it gets high enough, even though your odds are worse, I'll sometimes do it. And I'll think, if I'm buying the property, the first thing I'm going to do as a diehard hunter and angler, which used to be what a lot of people who moved to a lake were. My older colleagues used to tell me it used to be people that were passionate about fishing and hunting. And, over time, obviously, we've seen it's a social.
It's shifted greatly.
It's a socioeconomic, you're going to have your affluent folks that it's limited property and it costs more. And, that's what the free market does. But if it were me moving out there, you're looking for a way to really help out, plant your shoreline back to natives and just leave it alone. That riprap that we talked about, you know what that's doing? That's replacing the role of emergent vegetation, like cattails and bulrush. It's buffering the shoreline against wind and wave erosion. It's providing habitat for fish and wildlife. It's sequestering nutrients, stopping algal blooms from all those nutrients washing in, like holding onto the shoreline. Like there's so many services that they're providing. And instead we're ripping them out to do what? To replace them with boulders. Like it's the most foolish thing to spend thousands and thousands of dollars to do. And I see it happen, or it's already happened in so many instances, that if you want to reverse that, go back, let your shoreline be natural, leave it alone, don't mow it, let the plants come in, seed plants, you'll see it. You'll see the fish hanging out in there. You'll see wildlife hanging out over there. You'll have your own little microhabitat ecosystem right there. And if you're diehard about it, that's what I say to my own kids. When we go out and we swim in a lake, how many kids do you hear go, oh my gosh, I touched some plant, it's so gross. I say, no, this is, I can pull that plant and we can look at it and say, this is northern water milfoil. This is featherleaf pondweed. This is, you can tell them what the plant is, what an important role it plays, and not think twice about touching it. Cause that's, it's just like wading through a sea of grass and a pheasant hunt. Like you don't think twice about it. You got to have the habitat there. So we kind of have to train people to think differently about habitat. And particularly if you're passionate and live on a lake and you want to have an impact, go against the grain, have a natural shoreline. And to answer your question even earlier, there are programs, there are small grant dollars, usually with soil and water conservation districts, within counties, sometimes watershed districts, and sometimes some very forward-thinking lake associations do come up with these grant programs to try to incentivize doing some of the work or to do a cost share that helps with some of it.
I think those are really great points that you brought up, and I'm hoping that at least a few listeners, at least investigate this. It's hard for me to see some of those shifts and see a lot of our aquatic habitat disappear. I even think about the shoreline I used to fish as a kid. I remember when chemicals were introduced into the lake by the private landowner, and it took out all of these bulrushes that I used to catch, bass and sunfish and stuff around, and those don't exist anymore, and neither do those fish. They're not in that area because there's simply no structure for them. But talking about that, as a kid, I used to fish off the shoreline a lot. It was really important to me because I had access to a small boat, but I could only kind of go out in that area. But we loved to hop on our bikes, and with so many lakes close, we'd, go down to this bridge or that bridge or this shoreline or whatever. And I think it's critical that we have opportunities like that for people, shore fishing opportunities. And I know the DNR is constantly looking at different ways that they can provide that for the public. But is the DNR, are they moving forward with acquiring any land for that specific purpose? Are they looking at all at purchasing tracts that come up for sale to simply put in like a fishing pier?
Yes, absolutely. The short answer is yes. The Get Out More funding dollars that was a one-time appropriation from the big budgetary surplus here just a couple years ago. That some of that was earmarked for shore fishing, and a number of places were lined up for infrastructure replacements, and in some cases for fee title acquisition, what you're talking about, or in other cases, easements, angling easements. This is a wonderful way. So a landowner can hold on to the property. They're now allowing permission for people to come in and fish. This is done a lot, particularly on trout streams. Like southeastern Minnesota is absolutely awesome for anyone. I know we're on an ice fishing podcast, but if you love fishing, period, and you can get down to southeast Minnesota, so many of those miles of streams are accessible because they have private lands, fishing easements on them, 66 feet off the center line. So the landowner can still own it, but people can come in and fish. And that was one of the best things that was done in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and continues today, adding more easements to these streams. And there's all kinds of places across the state where additional opportunities are being explored. There's a couple that are underway in my own work area that they're not completed and the ink isn't dry on them yet, but I'm excited for them to move ahead. So absolutely, we were looking for those places. And I loved how you laid out that question, Jason, because I think we can get, we can sometimes forget our roots, right? Like
Right.
guys like you and I, you know, we go home and we have a boat and there's, you know, 4 fish houses in the rafters and there's, you know, my wife has 50 purses and I have 100 fishing rods,
Right.
you know, and so it's one of those things like we're all about it and we're fully invested. But when you're starting out, you don't have all that and you need your roots. You need a place to shore fish from. I mentioned growing up 2.5 miles from Lake Marion. That's where I rode my bike down to and fished off of a shore fishing section, or went over to the Broughton Run Gun Club launch, or went over to the county park. Like, you need those places. And if you're brand new to angling, or you're young, you're urban, you're brand new to the state of Minnesota, you just moved up here, whatever your reason is, if you don't have that fishing background, like, fishing is for everyone. It's not just for whomever, you know, it's not just for the people that grew up and had the luxury of their family did it. You know, I'm an adult onset hunter. My dad did not hunt at all. And I'm grateful that I got to learn, you know, to do things on my own. And I did it without assistance, but that really is not the norm, right? Like, we need to provide a helping hand to anyone that wants to learn how to do it. And one of the ways is to provide shore fishing opportunities for folks that may not have big financial means. All they have to do is show up with a fishing rod and they'll have a place to fish.
2 things. One, yeah, I mentioned it on the last podcast. Everybody starts somewhere. I have a really nice boat right now. I didn't always even have a boat. And ice fishing. I mean, I didn't fish out of a round hole until I was probably a teenager, because our auger was so dull it couldn't cut. I'd chisel the hole and sometimes try to use the auger just to shape it like a circle so it wouldn't freeze in as quickly, you know? And everybody does get their start somewhere. And those shore fishing opportunities, that not just for people who don't have a lot of experience fishing. There's a ton of people that have a lot of experience fishing. You might be traveling. I love to carry a rod in my vehicle when I travel, whether that's to go out on the ice or to go on a shoreline. But then the other thing you were talking about is that it's kind of our due diligence to educate others about the outdoors and to teach people. And that's been a big focus of mine in the last several months, is really thanking some of those mentors that I had in life. There's plenty of them that have gone away, and I didn't truly get to thank them in the way that I felt would be appropriate. But anybody that's listening, think back to your own development and the way that you got into fishing and hunting, and all those mentors that meant something to you, that reached out, and what, maybe it was even just a phone call and gave you some tips about something, but you can do the same thing. And it's almost like it's your assignment to, because you've been given that, you need to give it back.
Oh, for sure. No, you are 100% right. Gotta thank those people before they're out of your life, because people aren't around forever. So that's a great point.
Well, Scott, when we were chatting, we talked a little bit about lake associations. Lake associations came up, and I work with a lot of lake associations here, because when they have their annual meetings, they like to have me come in and kind of give them a state of what's going on in their lake. They like to hear some fishing tips. They like to hear, oh yeah, there's walleyes in our lake. Everybody wants to hear that. But I get calls sometimes. I do, as a guide, of landowners who want more fish in their lake. And they kind of look towards me to bolster their argument one way or the other. And I don't get involved in that, I'll tell you that. But can you share with us, if like a private landowner, let's say they wanted to commit some of their own money to stocking fish in the lake because they think that more is better, right? What actually happens?
So whether you're on a private water body in Minnesota or a public water body, you need to fill out a private fish stocking and transportation permit proposal. And ideally, if you're contemplating this, and you're on a public lake, you'd be having a conversation with the area fishery supervisor about what is currently in place with the Department of Natural Resources Fisheries Management Plan, and is stocking a part of that plan already. I think sometimes I'm in the same position as you, where we get approached about, there's some fish stocking already going on. Some is good, more would be better. And it's back to that, line about stocking not being a panacea. And there's kind of this sweet spot that you want to be in if you're going to do some stocking at all. In many cases, there's natural reproduction, and Mother Nature is taking care of herself. In other instances, maybe there's a little bit of a need for supplemental stocking. But, you keep in mind that if the agency, if I've got a lake and I've got a stocking plan in place for it, and I've got some other management actions that are in place, as much as this may send shivers down the spine of a listener, you almost have to think of it like an experiment, right? You've got inputs that are going into it, and you've got outputs. How is that lake performing? And that experiment is kind of watching over time. And if you've got a creel survey, you can kind of see if anglers are catching those fish and they're showing up. But you're also looking at your capture gears. When you're going out and surveying that lake, are you picking those fish up? What are they showing you when you index? What are we learning from the data that we're collecting? So if I've got someone that's saying, well, we'd like to stock these extra fish, I would say, well, what's the goal of it? What are you trying to achieve? Is that a meaningful number? Is it already something that we're doing? If it's something that we're already doing, there's no sense in having you guys, spend your money on it. If it's above and beyond that, is it something that we really want to do? Because it might, run interference on it. We might have stocked one particular year class, and all of a sudden they want to stock a different year class, and now we can't track year class fates, right? Because we wanted to see how the natural reproduction was doing in that skip year, for example.
Exactly.
You kind of get into this instance of you have to pay attention to what's happening. You can't introduce more noise into the data set. And sometimes, to be quite honest, I feel like there can be a lot of wasted dollars. We get a lot of requests. I shouldn't say a lot, but I get a few requests where there's requests for panfish stocking. And we don't do a lot of panfish stocking in Minnesota, with the exception of the Fishing in the Neighborhood program in the 7-county metro area and in winter kill situations.
So why
and
don't
the
you?
reason
Yeah.
the reason is this. When we think about panfish, and I'm going to exclude perch out of this, so just talk about bluegills and crappies, sunfish and crappies, right? They're all from the same fish family. They're all from Centrorchidae. They're all Centrorchid sunfish family. All right, quiz time. Dr. Durham,
Oh God.
what when it comes to reproduction, what do those fish do? Give me how males and females behave and what are their spawning tendencies.
Oh my gosh, you're really putting me on the spot here.
No, you got this. Don't overthink it.
What are their spawning tendencies? Like the male makes the nest, the female deposits the eggs, the male stands and
Bingo.
guards them.
Bingo. They're nest garters.
Yeah.
We usually see pretty consistent reproduction. And if there is a niche opportunity for those species, they will fill it. If the opportunity exists for those fish to be in that lake, they will be there. They will fill the niche. So if you don't see a lot of panfish, conditions may not be such that that they're doing super well or they're super abundant or whatever. A one-time stocking or a consistent stocking of fish that are already doing the work for you and spawning consistently and making nests out there, it doesn't make a lot of sense for you to drop a whole bunch of coin to go stock those fish. So that's probably one of the big requests that I see the most. And there's a failed history of it where we've got these records that go back, before there was a lot of, scientific rigors to the job, where it was just kind of throwing paint against the wall and fish were stocked all over the place, back 50, 60, 70 years ago. You can see that it really didn't move the needle with those populations. The ecology sort of sets everything up for itself. Those fish are going to naturally fluctuate up and down within a certain range. And, a pulse of stocking more really isn't going to change them all that much. Again, just because those are species that do well reproducing on their own.
But we have seen a shift in the panfish throughout the state. What can we do? How is this situation being addressed?
Well, when you say a shift in panfish across the state, what are you referring to?
Size.
So, and it sort of depends if we're talking specifically about bluegill, if we're talking about crappie.
Bluegill.
Yep. So bluegill, really good information for anyone that's wondering. Quality Sunfish Initiative. If you go to mndnr.gov and you search that, you can learn a little bit more. Quite a media opportunity, I'll say, where Linder Media and some other folks did partner with the agency to talk about what's happened with bluegills in Minnesota and declining size structure. And that's back to what we talked about earlier, where we, you succinctly stated it, right? We've got males build and guard a nest, females that deposit eggs. That has to just do with life history of bluegill sunfish. And they have these alternative life history strategies. What you want to see is the parental males, which are those big, knob-headed, dark-scaled, giant male bull bluegills. These are the ones that delay their maturity, their sexual maturity, until later in life, and they put their energy and resources into somatic cell growth. They get very large, and then when they're large and mature, then they spawn.
I did not know that.
In the bluegill world, there's two alternate strategies. There's the cuckolder strategy, where there's these small, silvery, not fully colored, not very large males that reach sexual maturity sooner, and they'll run in and spawn on a nest. They'll spawn eggs while a male bluegill that's guarding the nest is away or is distracted or what have you. So we have these cuckolders that'll move in, and sometimes they'll have these sneaker males, where these males emulate body posturing and the look of a female, and will come in and do the same thing, basically sneak in and fertilize eggs.
Okay, I have to know right now. Okay, what is the body posturing of a female bluegill?
You'd have to be a sunfish to understand it. Is this going to be your next ice show outfit or what?
No, I find this so interesting because, think about that, how the fish can recognize that just because of a change of posture. Think about then how they interpret your bait sometimes, that maybe a different angle gives it a whole different effect.
Right.
It's
Right.
wild. It's a wild thought. Okay, go on though. This is
Yeah.
very
No, no.
interesting, by the way.
Well, all of that is to say that there's these different life history strategies, and the ones that the anglers that we desire are these large, big-bodied males. And the literature just shows, the research shows that you need those big males to dominate the male population, and there's tremendous value in putting big male sunfish back. Putting large sunfish back is really beneficial, and you know there's a belief, well, you can never fish down sunfish. You can never fish them down because they're so consistent in reproduction. That's true. You can't fish them down in most cases. But what you can fish down is the quality and the size, right? You see those declines all the way up to your little hometown, Park Rapids, Minnesota, the Fuller's hardware store, old fishing contests,
For
all
sure.
those records that were kept, showing this decline over 50 years. And we don't have those giant bluegills, those unexploited bluegill populations that used to be out there. So what can we do? Give bluegills more time. If we aren't harvesting as many, if we reduce those bag limits from 20 to say 10 or 5, that can be meaningful because it's a painful reduction. If you're used to bringing 20 bluegills home and now you can only take 5, that's 75% reduction. So that is where, kind of like we were talking about with walleye limits, you really have to have a severe restriction to see an impact. And in this case, you're curtailing harvest enough. And hopefully that message is also coming out. That was, back to the social side of things we were talking about earlier. The data would suggest that you should really be putting these big sunfish back. But on the social side, it was not going to be popular to tell people that they had to release fish that were over a certain size, for instance. If you're a conservation officer and some kid on a bicycle, rolls past you and you go talk to him and he's got, you're telling him now when you go fishing with your buddies, you got to pack a ruler along and you got to measure all these fish, that's probably not going to be super palatable. So it's kind of striking a balance there and just reducing the harvest without a size restriction on it. And again, this is not something that is universally applied across the state because it's not going to work everywhere. But where there's a history of having big sunfish, of having that sort of potential, it's a good place to give it a try. And that's kind of where it's been a hand in glove sort of approach. Can you find those places where it works and where there is social support to do so when you have a public input process?
It was so interesting that you brought up the Fuller's Golden Book, because I was looking through one last night. It was actually from 1976, the year I was born. And I love poring over it. And for people who don't know, Fuller's Bait and Tackle was a historic bait shop on Main Street in Park Rapids, where you park in the middle of the street, by the way. And if you brought a fish in to enter it in their weekly contest, they would publish it in a publication at the end of the year called Fuller's Golden Book. So it had every entry, every fish that was brought in for the contest was, written down in this book, and it was very comprehensive. I mean, there are thousands of entries in there. That used to be the thing to do. If you caught a fish, it didn't even have to be big. You brought it in for the contest because you wanted to win something. There was value to that in your mind. Well, looking through those fish that were entered in that contest, I can't tell you, Scott, how many 1 pound plus bluegills were entered. It was a lot.
Yes.
And so so some people would look back on that information and go, "Oh man, fishing was so much better back then." Well, maybe not, because I don't doubt that we catch near that number. Well, maybe not near that number, but I don't doubt that there are a number of anglers that catch those massive fish now and recognize that the importance of them in the ecosystem and let them go. And so I think over time, anglers have really done a good job of evolving, for sure. I mean, think about just catch and release. That concept is not that old. And so I think as anglers, we're doing a good job, but how can we do a better job? What can we really, if you were going to hammer home one point to anyone who's listening, what is one thing as an angler you can do that's going to help everybody out?
Well, I don't know. Everything in moderation, I suppose, because that's the thing. You could look at how what we do socially impacts behavior, and you see that, right? Like 20, 30 years ago, there's no one that would be throwing, 9, 10 inch blue, not no one, but very few people that would be throwing back 9 or 10 inch
Right.
bluegills, and you wouldn't be throwing back these walleyes. And now I think people are sort of conditioned to large walleye lakes having protective slot limits that protect spawning stock biomass and try to keep more spawners in the system. And, they encourage harvest of smaller walleyes, and you still get your photo fish. And that's worked in a lot of places. And there's other places where, it's not I'm not going to say it's completely foolproof, but it's got a pretty good batting average. I'll say it that way. But all that is to say, like, moderation, right? If I talk to southeastern Minnesota, where there's trout streams that are catch and release only, and they go, man, the density dependence is so high because we keep putting these fish back, and no one ever harvests everything, that they're all stunted and they're stacked up. So you can overuse a strength, like you can overuse something. You can, protect fish too much, or our ethic can go that far that now everyone wants to catch and release bass, and we put all these bass back, and there's density dependence and the growth slows down. So a little bit of moderation goes a long way, I guess. And that would be my soapbox thing, I guess, is, keep what you need to eat, enjoy a meal of fish. I think it's good to have that connection to eat what you're pursuing, to go have that hunter angler kind of mentality where you're in touch with the resource because you're consuming it, and you're enjoying that aspect of it. Enjoy the experience of it, getting out and enjoy the resource, the lake, the beauty of being out there, doing it with friends and family. Keep a few fish, take pictures, have a good time, kind of everything in moderation.
Well, Scott, I appreciate you being on the show today. And I'm really excited actually to do another podcast with you. And I would like to do it from the perspective of an angler, because we talked about so many wonderful DNR things, items, I guess I would say, and you connecting it to just the everyday angler really made that meaningful. But I want you back on as a guest where we're just talking fishing, because I know you are a big trout nut and lake trout. You just went ice fishing for them last weekend, and we need to pick your brain more about trout and just ice fishing in general. So I'm excited to have you back on again. So thank you for coming on.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. It's fun chatting, and yeah, we'll do it again sometime.
Absolutely. Well, thank you all for tuning into the Ice Team podcast. This is Jason Durham reminding you, be safe, be smart, and be a hero. Take somebody fishing.